Somewhere in a lab, a machine reads a swab of saliva and spits out a number that has quietly rewritten the family history of tens of millions of people. Not a rumor, not a guess. A number drawn straight from the molecules inside their own cells, telling them things that slavery-era paperwork was designed to erase. For most Black Americans, the paper trail of who their ancestors were stops cold somewhere around 1870, sometimes earlier, because before that date, the people who would become their great-grandparents were not listed by name in most official records. They were listed as property. DNA does not care about that erasure. DNA was there the whole time, quietly recording every union, every birth, every unwilling and every willing pairing between people from radically different corners of the world, and it has been sitting in the genome ready to be read for as long as human beings have existed. Only in the last 2 decades have scientists actually built the tools to read it properly, and the newest of those tools, released in the final months of 2025, is more precise than anything that has come before it. Here is the plain, unembellished starting point, the number that shows up over and over again in peer-reviewed genetics literature going back more than a decade. On average, a Black American carries somewhere between 75 and 85% of their genome tracing to African populations, and somewhere between 15 and 25% tracing to European populations, with a small residual sliver, usually well under 2%, tracing to Indigenous American ancestry. That is the average. It is not the individual. Large-scale genetic surveys using hundreds of thousands of customer samples have shown that the actual spread around that average is enormous. Some individuals who identify as Black American carry as little as 1% African ancestry. Others carry as much as 99%. The label African American was never a genetic category to begin with. It was a social and historical category built out of one-drop laws, segregation, and shared cultural experience, not out of a uniform genome. What the DNA data does is peel that social label away and show the biological reality underneath it. And the biological reality is a spectrum, not a single point. To understand why that spectrum exists, you have to go back to the actual mechanics of how African and European ancestry mixed together on this continent in the first place. And this is where the science gets uncomfortable, because it is not just abstract population genetics. It is a genetic record of specific historical dynamics. Multiple independent studies using different methods and different data sets have converged on the same finding. The admixture between African and European ancestry in the Americas was not evenly distributed between men and women. It was sharply, consistently biased by sex, and the direction of that bias tells its own story. Researchers measure this by comparing 3 different parts of the genome that inherit differently. The Y-chromosome passes only from father to son, so it tracks purely paternal male line ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, regardless of the child's sex, so it tracks purely maternal female line ancestry. The autosomes, the 22 paired chromosomes that make up the bulk of the genome, are inherited from both parents in roughly equal measure and reflect the combined ancestry of the whole family tree. When scientists compare all 3 side by side in Black American populations, a very specific and very consistent pattern shows up. European ancestry is dramatically overrepresented on the Y chromosome and dramatically underrepresented in the mitochondrial DNA. African ancestry shows the exact opposite pattern. The actual numbers are striking. One widely cited genetic ancestry study of African Americans from Philadelphia found that European ancestry made up roughly 31% of Y chromosome lineages, but only 9 to 10% of mitochondrial lineages. A separate study analyzing 93 African American males in detail found European ancestry at 28.5% on the Y chromosome, compared to just under 20% on the autosomes and only 12% on the X chromosome, which is inherited more from mothers than fathers across a family tree. That same study calculated that the European male contribution to the African American gene pool was roughly 3 times higher than the European female contribution. In plain language, the European ancestry that Black Americans carry overwhelmingly entered the family tree through European men fathering children with African or African-descended women, not the reverse. And African ancestry has stayed remarkably intact on the maternal line across generations, which tells you that African women were the demographic anchor of Black family lineages throughout the admixture period, while European ancestry was funneled in almost exclusively through one direction. This is one of the clearest sex-biased admixture signals ever documented in human population genetics, and it lines up closely with what the historical record independently describes about power imbalance, coercion, and the legal structure of chattel slavery in the Americas, where enslaved women had no legal protection against sexual coercion from enslavers and overseers, and where children born from those unions were automatically classified as enslaved regardless of paternity. Genetics does not narrate motive or consent directly. and it cannot testify to what happened in any single relationship. It only records outcome, aggregated across millions of people and hundreds of years. But the outcome it records lines up closely with the documentary history that has survived from that same period. It's also worth flagging, in the interest of getting this exactly right, that some researchers have pushed back on just how extreme the sex bias really is. A methodological paper examining a large 23andMe-based study on this exact topic argued that part of the reported extreme skew could be attributed to how unassigned genetic ancestry was handled statistically, and to the limitations of simplified models of sex-biased admixture. The direction of the finding, more European ancestry entering through men, more African ancestry persisting through women, has held up across multiple independent studies using different methods in different populations. The exact size of that gap is still being debated and refined in the scientific literature, which is exactly how good science is supposed to work. There is a specific historical window attached to all of this, and it is narrower than most people expect. A large genetic analysis published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution, using ancestry data from across North and South America, determined that the majority of intercontinental admixture between African, European, and Indigenous American populations happened between 1750 and 1850. That 100-year window is when the genetic architecture of the modern African diaspora in the Americas was substantially locked in. The same research found that where a person's ancestors landed within Africa and how much of their ancestry ended up in North America versus Brazil versus the Caribbean was shaped by very physical, almost mundane factors. The wind and ocean current patterns of the North Atlantic versus the South Atlantic, which determined which port ships could realistically sail to and from, combined with the geopolitical reach of specific European colonial powers at specific moments in time. Voyages departing from ports tied to the North Atlantic current systems tended to land predominantly in North America. Voyages tied to South Atlantic routes tended to land predominantly in Brazil. This is a large part of why the specific mix of African ethnic and regional ancestry differs measurably between black populations in the United States, Brazil, Jamaica, and other parts of the Americas, even though all of these populations trace back to the same broad transatlantic system. Geography and ocean currents, not just historical accident, shaped the genetic map of an entire diaspora. Now, within that broad African component of ancestry, there is another layer of detail that most people never think to ask about, because for years the genetic testing industry simply could not resolve it. Africa is, by a wide margin, the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. Human beings have lived there longer than anywhere else, which means African populations have had far more time to accumulate genetic diversity between different regional and ethnic groups than any other continent. For most of the history of consumer DNA testing, that diversity got flattened into broad, almost unhelpful categories like West African or Sub-Saharan African, because the reference databases genetic testing companies used simply did not contain enough samples from enough distinct African populations to draw finer lines. That flattening was not really a scientific choice so much as a data availability problem, and it disproportionately affected the exact population that needed fine-grained answers the most, descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, whose paper genealogical trail is broken by design. That has now changed, and it changed very recently, not gradually over years, but in a specific dated announcement. In November 2025, the 23andMe Research Institute released what it describes as its largest African ancestry expansion to date. More than 250 high-resolution genetic groups across the African continent, layered on top of a separate, even more foundational overhaul of its core ancestry composition algorithm that had just rolled out weeks earlier. That underlying algorithm rebuild, referred to internally as version 7, was not cosmetic. It introduced a new DNA phasing pipeline designed specifically to reduce errors and improve accuracy for ancestry outside of Europe and the Americas, the exact populations that had historically been shortchanged by earlier Europe-centric reference panels. The update also eliminated the old broadly and unassigned catch-all categories from the default results view, categories that for years had functioned as a kind of scientific shrug, a way of saying we cannot tell you anything more specific than this. On top of that rebuilt foundation, the African genetic group's expansion added 33 new European populations and 6 new populations in the Americas, bringing the total number of distinct populations represented across the whole platform to more than 4,500. For people with African diaspora ancestry specifically, the practical result is that someone who previously would have seen a vague label like West African can now, in some cases, see a result tied to a specific present-day ethno-linguistic group. One example result the company has published shows a customer with 3 OINT, 6% Ancestry matched specifically to Edo and Ijaw peoples of what is now Nigeria, rather than just a generic regional label. Other released matches connect customers to Ashanti ancestry and to more than 24 distinct African ethno-linguistic groups in total across earlier phases of this same rollout. The company has been explicit that this expansion is powered in large part by its African Genetics Project, an initiative that specifically recruited and provided free testing kits to individuals with 4 grandparents born in the same African country, precisely to build the kind of dense, regionally specific reference data that had been missing for decades. It is worth being precise about what this new granularity actually represents scientifically, because it is easy to overstate. These genetic group matches are built primarily on identity winawasta by descent segment matching, meaning the system is looking for stretches of DNA that a customer shares, largely intact, with people in the reference database who have deep documented ties to a specific region or ethnic group. That is a different method from the older continental admixture percentages, which estimate broad ancestry proportions using statistical comparison against reference populations rather than shared inherited segments. A match to a specific genetic group generally represents an ancestor who lived within roughly the last 250 to 300 years, which lines up closely with that 1750 to 1850 admixture window identified independently in the peer-reviewed literature. It is not a claim that someone's entire African ancestry traces to one single ethnic group. Most African diaspora individuals will show a mix of several different regional and ethnic signals, reflecting the reality that the transatlantic slave trade pulled from many different points along the west and west central African coast over the course of centuries, often bringing together people from distinct ethnic and linguistic backgrounds onto the same ships and into the same plantation systems. That regional weighting is itself well documented independently of the new consumer platform. Peer-reviewed studies analyzing the within Africa genetic ancestry of African-descended populations in the Americas, using both mitochondrial DNA and broader genome-wide markers, have consistently found that the largest contributions trace back to West and West Central Africa, which matches the historical shipping and trading patterns of the slave trade almost point for point. What the 23andMe expansion adds is resolution within that already established broad pattern, not a contradiction of it. There's a separate thread of evidence worth pulling in here because it comes from a completely different kind of genetic marker, and it tells its own version of the same story. Y-chromosome data specifically, looking only at direct paternal lines, shows that roughly 65% of African American males carry a Y-chromosome that traces back to Africa, with the remaining share tracing predominantly to Europe. Layer that against the mitochondrial numbers from earlier, 9 to 10% European on the maternal line, and you get 2 independent lines pointing at the same underlying demographic reality from 2 different angles. A majority African paternal line overall, but a paternal European contribution that is still many multiples higher than the maternal European contribution. The most common African mitochondrial haplogroups showing up in these studies, labeled L1, L2, and L3 by geneticists, are themselves ancient lineages, some of the oldest recognized branches of the human maternal family tree, meaning the maternal thread connecting Black. Americans back to Africa is not just intact. It's tied to some of the deepest rooted lineages in the entire human species. Why does any of this matter beyond satisfying curiosity? For millions of people in the African diaspora, genealogical research runs into what genealogists themselves openly call a brick wall, a hard stop somewhere in the historical record where enslaved ancestors simply stop being named as individuals in surviving documents. Bills of sale, plantation inventories, and estate records sometimes listed enslaved people by first name only, or by age and monetary value, or not at all. Marriage records for enslaved people often did not exist in any legally recognized form, because enslaved marriages were not legally recognized in the first place. That means for a huge number of Black American families, the standard genealogical toolkit that works for tracing European American ancestry, birth certificates, church registries, immigration manifests, simply runs dry at a specific point, almost always somewhere in the first half of the 19th century or earlier. DNA-based genetic groups do not replace that missing paperwork, but they offer something that paperwork never could, a biological thread that survived the erasure completely intact, inherited quietly through every generation, regardless of what got written down or destroyed. For an individual doing this kind of research, a match to a specific present-day ethnic group is not just a data point. It can be the single piece of information that reopens a genealogical search that had been considered permanently closed. None of this should be read as a tidy, uncomplicated discovery story. And it is worth being honest about the limitations built into the science itself, because overselling genetic ancestry results is one of the most common ways this kind of content misleads an audience. Every ancestry composition percentage, from the oldest tests to the newest 2025 update, comes with a margin of error, and that margin tends to widen the further back in time and the more mixed the ancestral population being estimated. Reference panels, even expanded ones, are still built from present-day populations, being used as proxies for historical ones, and present-day ethnic and national boundaries do not map perfectly onto the population structures that existed 2 or 3 centuries ago. A match to a specific genetic group reflects shared DNA with people who have strong ties to that group today. It is evidence of likely regional ancestral origin, not a certified genealogical record with legal standing. Different testing companies, using different reference databases and different algorithms, can and do produce somewhat different percentage breakdowns for the exact same person, which is part of why serious researchers keep publishing methodological checks and critiques of these estimates, rather than treating any single number as final. It is also worth sitting for a moment with what this data actually represents, underneath all the percentages and population labels. This is not abstract history. Every admixture signal that shows up in a genome today was, at the individual level, a specific relationship between 2 specific human beings, living inside a specific and often brutal historical system. The consistent, repeated finding of a European male, African female admixture pattern is not a neutral statistical curiosity to be presented with detached enthusiasm. It sits alongside a well-documented history of sexual coercion and legal powerlessness that enslaved women faced, a history that survivors were rarely permitted to record in their own words through official channels. At the same time, the equally consistent finding that African maternal lineages remained the demographic backbone of Black American families throughout that entire period is its own kind of historical statement, one about continuity and identity that persisted underneath a system explicitly designed to strip it away. Responsible science communication means holding both of those truths at once, presenting the data accurately, and not flattening the human weight behind it into a purely sensational hook. Where does the science go from here? 23andMe has publicly stated that the 2025 expansion is explicitly a first phase, not a finished product, with a list of roughly 60 target countries identified as priorities for future reference data collection, specifically because those countries currently have large populations that remain underrepresented in existing genetic databases. Independent researchers tracking these updates have noted that the most recent rounds of improvement leaned heavily toward European ancestry granularity, and that meaningful further improvement specifically to African regional resolution is still expected, likely arriving in additional updates rather than being fully complete with this one release. In other words, the picture available right now, detailed as it is compared to just a few years ago, is still a snapshot of an ongoing process, not a final answer. Every year that passes brings more reference samples, better statistical models, and finer resolution, which means some of the specific percentages and group matches a person sees on their results page today may shift somewhat as the underlying science continues to mature, and that ongoing refinement should be treated as a sign of scientific honesty rather than a reason to distrust any single update along the way. There's also significant regional variation within the United States itself, and this part of the data rarely gets attention even though it is well established in the population genetics literature. A study using population-specific genetic markers across 10 different American cities and 1 Caribbean population found that the average European genetic contribution to Black populations ranged from as low as 8% in Jamaica, up to 5% in New Orleans, with cities like Charleston, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Houston falling at various points in between. That is not random noise. It reflects real differences in local colonial history, the specific demographics of enslavers and enslaved populations in each region, the degree of urban versus rural admixture opportunity, and the particular trajectories different communities took after emancipation. New Orleans in particular carried a distinct colonial history under both French and Spanish rule, with a comparatively large free population of color and a different legal and social structure around interracial relationships than existed in, say, the Deep South cotton economy. And that distinct history is still visible today as a measurable difference in average European ancestry percentage among Black residents. This is one of the clearest examples of how genetic data and documented social history reinforce each other rather than existing as separate stories. The DNA didn't need the historians to tell it what happened in New Orleans, and the historians didn't need the DNA to know it either, but seeing the two independently converge on the same conclusion is part of what makes this field of research credible rather than speculative. It's worth pausing on the difference between self-identification and genetic ancestry too, because this is one of the areas where sensationalized content most often misleads its audience. A person's self-identified racial or ethnic identity is a social, cultural, and personal category, shaped by upbringing, community, family history as it was told and remembered, and lived experience navigating a society that has never treated race as a simple biological fact. Genetic ancestry percentages are a separate biological measurement of which historical populations a person's DNA statistically traces back to. These two things usually correlate strongly at the population level, which is exactly why the average ancestry figures cited earlier hold up as meaningful. But at the individual level, they can diverge in ways that surprise people. Someone can identify strongly as Black American, culturally and personally, while carrying a genetic ancestry composition that skews more heavily European than the population average, and the reverse is also true. Neither case makes anyone's identity less real or less valid. And no responsible geneticist working in this field would ever suggest otherwise, because identity and ancestry are simply answering two different questions that happen to overlap most of the time without being interchangeable. What it does mean is that a genetic test result should never be framed, in a video or anywhere else, as some kind of final biological verdict on who someone really is. It is one additional piece of information layered on top of identity, not a replacement for it, and responsible science communication draws that line clearly instead of blurring it for dramatic effect. There's also a broader pattern worth connecting here, because Black American ancestry doesn't sit in isolation from the rest of the admixed populations of the Americas. The same sex-biased pattern, elevated male contribution from the colonizing population, elevated female contribution from the colonized or enslaved population, shows up again and again across Latin America and the Caribbean, just with different source populations involved. Studies comparing Iberian colonization patterns in Latin America found a parallel structure. High non-European female contribution to populations, descended primarily from European settlers, mirroring the same underlying power dynamics playing out with Indigenous American women in those regions instead of African women. Seeing the same genetic signature repeat itself across multiple independently colonized regions of the Americas, using completely different source populations each time, is itself a kind of confirmation. It suggests this was not a one-off, historical quirk specific to the United States, but a structural feature of how colonial admixture happened across the hemisphere wherever similar power imbalances existed. There's a genealogical wrinkle here that connects directly to the post-emancipation period, and it's worth explaining because it shapes why DNA has become such an important tool for this specific population in particular. After emancipation, newly freed people across the American South had to adopt legal surnames, often for the first time in any officially recorded sense, in order to be registered as citizens, sign contracts, marry legally, or claim land. The surnames chosen varied widely. Some freed people took the surname of their former enslaver, sometimes out of practicality, sometimes for reasons tied to land or continued economic relationships in the immediate post-war period. Others deliberately chose different surnames, sometimes the name of an earlier enslaver from a previous generation, sometimes an entirely new name unconnected to any enslaver at all, chosen specifically as an act of self-definition. What this means, practically for modern genealogy, is that a shared surname between a Black family and a white family in the same region is not reliable evidence of a genetic relationship on its own. It might reflect a direct biological connection tracing back to the admixture events described earlier in this video. It might just as easily reflect the fact that an entire community of formerly enslaved people took the surname of the largest local plantation, regardless of any biological tie. Surname-based genealogy, the primary tool available to most family historians, simply cannot distinguish between these two very different scenarios. DNA testing can, at least at the population and often at the individual level, because it is reading the actual inherited genetic material rather than a name chosen under a specific set of 19th century legal and social pressures. This is another reason genetic ancestry work has become such a central part of Black American genealogy, specifically in a way it has not needed to be to the same degree for populations whose surname records reliably tracked biological lineage across generations. Put yourself for a moment in the position of someone actually receiving one of these updated results. Picture a person who grew up knowing, in the vaguest possible sense, that their ancestors came from somewhere in West Africa, because that is the only answer available in most American history classrooms and most family conversations passed down across generations where the specifics were never recorded in the first place. That person takes a DNA test, maybe years ago under an older, less precise version of the technology, and receives a broad label, something like Nigerian and Cameroonian, broadly West African, with no further detail available, essentially a highlighted region on a map covering hundreds of millions of people in dozens of distinct ethnic groups and languages. Now, picture that same person logging back into their results after the November 2025 update and finding, for the first time, a specific match to a genetic group like the Edo and Ijaw peoples, or a connection tied to Ashanti ancestry, complete with a map showing specifically where that population has lived for generations and information about the ethno-linguistic community associated with it. That shift from an entire subcontinent's worth of possibility down to a specific named present-day cultural group is not a small update from a user experience standpoint. For someone who has spent years hitting a genealogical brick wall at roughly 1850 with no names, no records, and no direction to search further, that kind of specific match can be the first concrete lead they have ever had. It can point towards specific cultural practices, specific historical regions, and in some cases even living communities today who share that same ancestral connection, opening doors that pure documentary research had permanently closed for generations. None of this erases the limitations already discussed. A single genetic group match is still a statistical inference built on shared DNA segments and reference population data, not a name-for-name family tree reaching back 3 centuries. But it is a fundamentally different starting point than what existed even 5 years ago. And it represents the kind of incremental, evidence-based progress that actually characterizes real scientific advancement, as opposed to the overnight, all questions answered narrative that gets attached to this topic in less careful corners of the internet. The honest version of this story is less tidy than the sensational version, but it is, if anything, more remarkable, precisely because it is true and because researchers are still actively working to make it more accurate with every passing year. What all of this adds up to is not a single dramatic reveal, but a genuinely significant shift in what is knowable. For most of American history, the ancestry of Black Americans was treated, socially and legally, as a single flattened category, stripped of the specific regional, ethnic, and family detail that other American communities were allowed to keep and pass down. The genetic record was always there, embedded in every cell, completely indifferent to the paperwork that tried to erase it. It has simply taken until now, until reference databases large enough and methods precise enough finally existed, for that record to become readable at anything close to the level of detail available to people with well-documented family trees. The fact that a saliva swab and a sequencing machine can now trace a thread back toward Edo and Ijaw ancestors, or Ashanti ancestors, or other specific West and West Central African communities, in a way written records systematically could not, is not exaggeration, and it is not hype. It is peer-reviewed, it is dated, and it is still actively unfolding. And for a population whose genealogical past was deliberately obscured for generations, that shift from vague continental guesswork toward specific, named ancestral communities is one of the more quietly significant developments happening in human genetics right now. There's one more thing worth saying plainly before closing this out, because it is easy to lose in the middle of percentages and population labels and dated press releases. None of this science exists in a vacuum separate from the people it describes. Every statistic in this video represents millions of individual family histories, most of which were never written down, most of which were actively suppressed by the legal and social systems of their time, and all of which survived anyway, encoded in a molecule too small to see and too stubborn to erase. The researchers building these reference databases, running these phasing algorithms, and publishing these admixture studies are not just producing academic papers. They are, slowly and imperfectly and one update at a time, handing back a piece of documented history that was deliberately taken away from an entire population generations ago. That is worth remembering the next time a new Ancestry update rolls out. The next time a percentage shifts by a point or two, or the next time someone opens their results and sees, for the first time, a name for a place their ancestors actually came from. A name that no courthouse record, no plantation ledger, and no census taker ever bothered to preserve, but that their own genome carried forward regardless, patiently, for over 250 years, waiting for the science to finally catch up.